Hello, my name is Pam Tipton. I'm the Director of Executive Programs at Emory's Goizueta Business School, and I am so excited to have you join us this morning for our Business Over Breakfast. So while the past year and a half really has brought its share of challenges, it's also provided a breeding ground for entrepreneurship and innovation. This has been especially true right here in Atlanta and all throughout the Southeast, where startups and investors have coalesced to create a vibrant hub of new business models, innovations, and investment opportunities. The Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation has been at the forefront of some of the growth through its focus on three distinct pillars: supporting new venture startups by students and alumni, connecting students with venture capitalists for application learning opportunities, and studying the innovation challenges, excuse me, of large, complex companies. So today, we are really fortunate to have with us two of the center's leaders to talk more about the trends they've noticed in the recent years. Amelia Schaffner, the director of the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and Dr. Rob Kazanjian, the academic director of the center and the Asa Kendler Griggs Professor of Organization and Management. Amelia is responsible for developing the school's entrepreneurial culture, thinking, and initiatives, partnering with students, faculty, and alumni, and the local ecosystem of investors, VCs, and organizations. She is involved in a number of initiatives, including the partnership with the Atlanta Tech Village Incubator, the Entrepreneurs in Residence in Program, the RAISE Forum for Startups and Investors in the Southeast, and the AHIA, or the Advancing Healthcare Innovation in Africa Initiative. Previously, Amelia was the senior principal at Accenture and led a global innovation initiative where she was instrumental in visioning Accenture's innovation architecture. Rob has worked in almost every aspect of Goizueta, and I've had the privilege of witnessing a lot of that from administrative roles as interim dean of the business school to leading a wide variety of our programs, including executive education and teaching students across all of the degree programs. His early research had centered on the growth and development of high-tech startups, and more recently, he's been studying the challenges of innovation in large, complex organizations. His work is published in a number of leading academic journals and in several books. In the world of practice, he has consulted and done executive education work in the areas of strategy, strategic change, organizational design, and innovation with a number of Fortune 50 companies. He's also regularly taught in senior executive programs across the US, as well as in Europe and Asia. Suffice it to say, you're in good hands today with Rob and Amelia. They're both amazing resources, and we're really fortunate to have them both here with us today. Rob and Amelia are going to spend about 30 to 40 minutes sharing some of their insights, and then we'll transition to our Q&A period. They are happy to answer questions as we go along, so we invite you to use the Q&A box to insert your questions, and we'll do our best to get the questions to Rob and Amelia over the course, and if not, we'll get to them at the end. At the end of today's session, there will be a short survey, and we really invite your input. That really helps us as we look forward to other sessions. So with that, I'll kick it over to Rob and Amelia.
Great. Thank you, Pam, very much. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody here. We love this format and the opportunity to share what we're doing at our center. It's been a pleasure to work with Amelia as well. I thought I'd start with a bit of kind of historical context. Being the old guy on the call, I've been in the field as a faculty member or a student for more than 4 decades. And as Pam had mentioned, I began with the study of entrepreneurial ventures as my dissertational work and my early research. And interestingly, although I've been at Goizueta for about 30 years, even before I moved to Atlanta, I got exposed to the entrepreneurship culture in Atlanta in the early 1980s, actually. So I thought we want to do a couple things today. One is to talk about kind of trends across our area or scope of helping startups, working with supportive funding, and also with the more recent focus we've had on managing innovation in large, complex companies. Two things. One is the kind of what's going on in town. The other is what's going on in business schools in particular. When I was doing my early research, there was just the very emergence of things that were called incubators. And actually, in the early 80s, I discovered ATDC, which was one of the very first of these that was created. And they have a long and distinguished history of doing things. And they were based in Atlanta, close to Georgia Tech. And it was a kind of interesting new model of giving a home and supporting resources to startups. But it was a bit of an anomaly. There weren't that many of those around. There may be half a dozen of them across the country. And of course, we've seen that expand pretty dramatically. Also, at that point in time, I was involved in a couple of studies with the very early emergence of corporate ventures groups. And in fact, did a couple qualitative studies in Exxon Ventures, which at the time was a kind of new, interesting approach for them as they thought about diversifying out of oil. It now turns out that at both ends of those trends, both the startup, entrepreneurship, incubation, focus and resources have exploded dramatically. And I would say similarly with corporate ventures group, what was a kind of one-off or interesting aside for study has now become something that many, many companies are engaged in. So that's sort of the land we want to cover and talk a bit about the landscape of kind of what goes on there. The other interesting thing is what goes on inside business schools. So again, looking back to the early part of my career, there was an occasional center for entrepreneurship at one business school or another. But by and large, both undergraduate and specifically MBA students were typically geared to go to work in finance. Back then, consumer marketing, consumer products marketing was a very big piece. I think later by the 90s, you began to see consulting take a much, much bigger footprint. And that was very much the mainstay, I would say, until the last 10 years or so, where we've seen a pretty dramatic shift to more of MBA students and undergraduate students looking for the opportunity, not just to go into entrepreneurship at some later point, but many times interested in starting their business while they're an MBA student. And many of us have seen this. I think there's a site that business school faculty focus on a lot called Poets and Quants, which kind of watches trends inside business schools. And they started a ranking of I think the 100 largest startups that were begun inside a business school. And these would be companies like Warby Parker that was started by, I think, 2 Wharton MBAs and has grown pretty dramatically. And there are lots and lots of examples of that. And we have our own examples of our own students that have done those kinds of things. So we're now finding more students with a strong interest in starting their own business. And we're now looking to kind of support that as much as we can. So that's a kind of recent trend. I would say we have taught entrepreneurship from very early on, but usually it was one course. We've expanded those offerings. We probably have almost a dozen classes that in some way touch on the challenge of starting and creating a new business. And correspondingly, we're very pleased within the last year, we were designated as a formal center, the Roberto C. Goizueta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And that created an umbrella for us to kind of pursue the tracks that we've identified. And so Amelia and I thought we would spend the time this morning walking you through our 3 pillars. So as you can see on the organizing chart, the next slide in the deck, that we have kind of 3 areas that we focus on within the center that kind of touch on a number of these things. One is entrepreneurship, where we help students and increasingly alums launch their new business idea. The second is early stage investing. We find lots of students interested in going into venture capital and understanding that it's an emerging area, and Atlanta is an emerging center for that. And then toward the end, corporate innovation is the third one we've just added. And again, part of corporate innovation is figuring out how to engage in the venture community. So I probably droned on long enough with this. Let me turn it over to Amelia. Amelia, you want to kind of walk us through a little bit of the pillars of the center, and we can kind of back and forth fill in the details as we go through those.
Yes, and I just also wanted to add, you mentioned yesterday how much more of our graduates. We just had Josh Luber come to classroom.
Yeah.
Professor Hirsch had invited him yesterday. He founded StockX, and he went undergrad first and then went into the MBA course. So we're seeing more and more the interest in sort of like starting companies and growing them while at the university.
And for those who don't know, StockX is Josh started this company as a platform for those people that, for lack of a better phrase, are called sneakerheads. They like to kind of buy and sell Nikes and other branded kind of sneakers. And I think he's doing another company now that's like a forum for playing cards. So we've got a long list of entrepreneurs out there that have been pretty successful. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So if you maybe, Pam, if you can move to the next slide, the way that we thought about sharing a bit more about this, we thought about going sort of like top down and looking at bigger trends that are happening in the economy and what's happened, especially over the last year, and kind of then slowly dig into what we're seeing in our neighborhoods, sort of in the Atlanta and sort of Southeast space, and then sort of talking a little bit more about how we as a business school are focusing on those various areas. So big trends that we're observing sort of in the general sort of startup entrepreneurship space, it's a good time for startups and for the entrepreneurs to found companies. We're seeing a growth in that. In fact, there's been a tremendous amount of new unicorns, and that's like billion-dollar evaluated companies that are starting to become more and more available even on the Atlanta market. If we look at, for example, if you go to the next slide, we're going to quickly show a chart and showing how much this has increased tremendously, the amount of these huge valuations. So unicorns have increased almost 500%, in the last year, basically. So that's a quick span. We've seen Atlanta, to the same rate increase. You get almost like a new unicorn every month, essentially. But of course, this is just an example of some of the ones that have come recently, especially in the last few months. And we've seen also more and more happening, like from Calendly to SalesLoft and Greenlight, and more recently, you heard about the phenomenon, for example, of MailChimp that was actually acquired by Intuit, although MailChimp is an interesting case, and we'll talk more about venturing later, but MailChimp is a bootstrapped company. So there are examples here in town of companies that have done that very well, not necessarily having to go to venture fund.
And I just remind everybody, unicorn means a company that's valued at $1 billion. Doesn't mean their revenue, but it's their valuation.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're seeing, as this economy is growing, Atlanta is growing tremendously, both from a population standpoint and from a business standpoint. This is just a quick geographical map. We wanted to put it on here to show you how all the different neighborhoods are starting to really pop up with startup support, entrepreneurship support. All of these that we've kind of highlighted here are just some of the incubation hotspots, if you will. You can spot, Emory, Goizueta there at the number in the 4 zone there, but they're all over town and places that are building and incubating startups. We partner with many of them. In fact, for example, we have, Rob had mentioned earlier, the partnership with Atlanta Tech Village. That's like the 4th largest incubator at the moment with 300 startups. We're also partnering with new sort of incubators that are coming up. For example, the Russell Center, which is focusing on underrepresented founders. So if we go back to the next going back to talking about the trends, we're seeing a lot emerging in a number of different areas. We talked a little bit about how we are partnering with incubators that are focusing on diversity. That is actually a trend that we're seeing more and more. The diverse startups are actually demonstrating to provide higher returns. We're also obviously in the midst of being in Atlanta. We think it's very important to support a number of different types of founders. One other thing to bring up, we're seeing a lot of different trends in general on the market. The no-code trend is becoming more and more a hot space that we're keeping an eye on. As a school, we don't have an engineering school, so certainly that is one that we have earmarked as an interest for us to help us increase the pace at which our startups are going to be growing, and the lowering of the barrier to access, basically for new founders, even without the coding and the engineering skill sets. So that's something we're actually looking into at the moment. Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything to that particular trend or in general.
No, I do think that one of the things we're seeing across industries is the extension of new business models as a vehicle for innovation. And so the simplest way to think about a business model is just an alternative way of bringing your product to market. And so the most prominent example is Amazon, their decision to sell direct. And so lots of people have decided to sidestep retail and go direct to consumers. And so you're finding lots and lots of new spaces where that can kind of get applied and pulled off. So one extension of that seems to be not just to sell direct, but also we're finding some spaces where the approach is to more tailor the product to the individual, and getting extremely focused on understanding the consumer and selling them exactly what they want. So across these trends, some of them are focusing on particular industries. Some of them are looking at this idea of business models and taking the business model, if you will, a step further.
Yeah, exactly. And we're seeing, we saw obviously the boom of the sharing economy. Everybody's familiar with that, but how now it's sort of moving into also new sectors in areas that we weren't familiar with before. For example, we've seen the big boom of kitchens and cloud kitchens and sharing all that. So basically, these business models that Professor Cassandra was mentioning are moving into new business areas, and also actually moving into new geographies too. We're seeing that once the models that have been established, like Uber and Airbnb, they're now moving into other geographies across the world.
Yeah, and one last thing I would add is, and we've seen this actually over a period of time, because we're one of multiple centers in the school. So there also was a center called Social Enterprise at Goizueta, and now it's been kind of broadened a bit to be an institute for business and society. But for a long time, they had a very rigorous, if not the most rigorous, research process on studying accelerators that focused on startups. And in particular, they had a strong interest in social enterprise or companies that were begun with a social component to what they did. And so we're seeing among students a strong interest, sometimes in their startup focused on a social problem that they want to solve, or the startup has a mission to not just satisfy a need in the market, but then also address something through sometimes some of their revenue going to a cause that they would like to focus on. And that's, I think, a product of the last decade. We tended to see less of that early on. It's much more prevalent among students right now, and I think among companies that are getting started.
Hey, Rob,
Yep.
We've got a question got popped in the chat I think is good to ask at this point, and that
Sure.
is, are you seeing any of the innovation coming specifically impacting nonprofit organizations? I know you just spoke about social impact and enterprise, and not all of those might be nonprofit.
Yeah, I don't know of too many that were begun as nonprofits, and that's actually an interesting thing for us to dig into a little bit more. But certainly this focus on social causes and issues, and sometimes these will be a wide range of challenges that are associated with, healthcare, with, issues of clean water in another part of the world where there's some product or service we can develop to address those things. So I do think it's in the umbrella of this broad view of understanding a social objective or cause, as well as the prospect of potentially making a return. We're seeing more of it in a business model as opposed to a nonprofit, but I'm actually going to dig into the nonprofit a bit more.
Yeah, one of the things that we're noticing also is that these companies that are started with nonprofit missions are actually becoming for-profit companies. We're seeing some examples even with our own. Louise Vasilevsky is an alumna, and she started a company supporting back to return to civic for inmates. And originally, the idea was maybe to focus on it as a nonprofit, but now it's a profit company. We've seen that in a company like Gooder here in Atlanta that is focusing on supporting, leftover foods, etc., redistribution of that, becoming a for-profit company. So that's another interesting trends that we're seeing. Not because you have a social mission doesn't necessarily mean you can't actually generate profit.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on this, and you can sort of do a little reading on the side of this as well. There are new organizational forms that are being created. One are what's called the BCorp, where companies include in their charter that they are not pursuing profit as the only objective, but rather are looking to make an impact on a social issue or cause. And this is being done because if they become this is as a public company, it removes the prospect of somebody suing them to say, hey, you're putting resources into something that should be returned to shareholders. And so it's an explicit a statement that as a public company, if you buy shares in this company, understand what you're buying. So again, it's this sort of trying to use a business logic and model to address more than just the bottom line.
Yeah. And so in looking at sort of going from these more general sort of bigger trends, in looking at what we're seeing here in Atlanta, we did a Crunchbase poll and we saw that there's about 6,000 different companies here in Atlanta, of which about 600 of them are really venture-backed startups. So we're seeing more and more interest in places that are supporting these startups, to accelerating these startups, maybe incubators, accelerating, and a number of companies that are being spawned also out of the large corporations that are here in town. And we'll talk a bit more about the corporate landscape in a little bit. Rob, do you want to add anything to, otherwise we can move into the CI?
Yeah, no, let's move into CEI.
Great. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about today, since we're here and sharing a little bit more about how we are thinking of supporting our students, entrepreneurs and our alumni entrepreneurs, but also generally our community overall. So we've started a number of programs. Some of them are meant to be bringing in the ecosystem from the outside in the walls of the school. So inviting entrepreneurs in residence, and these are entrepreneurs that have been successful, this many times serial entrepreneurs who have built many companies. Some of them are alumni and some of them are not. And they are essentially here to help us give advice to the center, but also help us mentor students that might be building in those areas. We have a number of accelerating programs and initiatives. So we run an annual accelerator. We have weekly pitch opportunities for students to actually pitch to professors and to help them sort of dissect their business model and help them open some doors with connections both in town but in general as they build their different startups. We run an annual summit that invites a number of our successful alumni entrepreneurs to campus, and it even includes a pitch competition with that. And then we have a number of different, obviously, efforts that help us build community. So build the network of alumni. We run some panels, the things that help us sort of bring those alumni back to campus and share their stories with the students. We also are trying to build a lot of partnerships, and that is when we talk about not being just on campus, sort of getting out of the building is where we're also trying to bring the students from out of campus to the ecosystem itself. So we have, for example, some connections with the Atlanta Tech Village, which we mentioned, but also Techstars and many groups that focus on specific areas like female focused accelerators and so forth. One thing that I think our students appreciate is the opportunity to have apprenticeships sometimes in these places, and the opportunity to actually work hand in hand with some of the startups that are in those places to actually pipeline them and learn more about what happens at a startup in the early stages.
And all of this stuff, I have to give Amelia a huge amount of credit, because I think one of the sort of shortcomings of Emory, and I fully admit it, I was part of the process. As a kind of tier 1 research university, we tend to focus on what goes on within our walls. And so we're very focused on our research and our students, but I think we're disconnected, and Amelia's established us with really close ties all across this very vibrant ecosystem. And so our students have benefited, and has our faculty, as we've been able to interact with this very, very rich, supportive environment for entrepreneurship and its expansion into funding. So it really is a very kind of helpful resource for students. And as Amelia talks about these programs, I hope you can see, and we can provide, there's additional information on our website and elsewhere, but we try to help students who have an idea take it beyond an idea, to put it into something one might think of more as a formal pitch, to get that pitch evaluated, and to take that idea as far as they can as a full-time student. And we've got plans for doing more of those kinds of things.
Hey, Rob or Amelia, William has asked, when MBA students are starting their business while they're in business school, what are their most common academic concentrations, or is there a most common?
It's sort of an interesting question. You can sort of pick entrepreneurship as your focus, but the courses in entrepreneurship cut across a wide range of areas. So the mainstays at the undergraduate level are Andrea Hirschhatter, who runs our BBA program. She's also a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship. She teaches a kind of general survey course on entrepreneurship and supports students' development. Charlie Getz does the same thing in for the MBA students and some of the BBAs. They're both sort of organization and management folks, but there's finance classes that get into private equity and valuation, and there's a couple classes there the students tend to take. There's marketing classes. One of the most popular faculty right now is Dan McCarthy. He does a lot of work on how valuations get created, especially for high-tech startups. He's gotten a lot of visibility lately for thinking some companies were overvalued as entrepreneurial efforts because of the way they calculate lifetime value of a customer or cost of acquisition. And so he puts a lot of rigor to that. So there's some marketing areas that students get into. So I think what happens is students follow the interests of their idea if their real focus is to start the company. But then there's another group of students in, I think, our MBA program and other MBA programs who have the idea, want to develop it as much as they can, but actually don't plan on starting the company until they've gone to work for, let's say, 5 or 7 years and learn a little more in business practice at a world-class company and amass a little bit of capital so they can push it on their own. So we're seeing this a bit bimodal. There are a small group of companies, small group of students who want to start the company almost right out of the MBA program. And then there's this group that we're seeing come back as alums 5, 7 years later, saying, I'm ready to start my company. I've done some of the groundwork, and we're trying to be there to support them as much as we can. So the shorter answer is there's no one path, but there's lots of courses to pick from.
Great. And I know this is very exciting. We can talk for hours about it. I realize it's 9:30, so
yeah,
we want to probably cover a few of more areas. So maybe let's move into the early stage investing and sort of cover the big trends here so that we can move in. So the general VC trends we're seeing, huge amount of influx of money into the market. More and more VCs are pouring money into the market with the, right now it's up at about 300 billion overall globally from the last numbers I looked at Crunchbase. But also if you look at the Atlanta market, it's growing tremendously. In just the half of this year, it's been $3 billion poured into venture funds in Atlanta. So we're seeing how much even Atlanta itself is becoming a center for influx of these funds. There's also interesting a new trend that we're observing that even larger, corporations have a lot of venture groups, and the CBNs I pulled out statistics that shows that about 1 in 4 of venture deals are actually driven by these corporate venture funds. So the market is moving, and this is creating obviously a tremendous and vibrant opportunity for our ecosystem that we're seeing around us. Rob, I don't know if you want to add anything to
Well,
this.
the only thing I would add, and it's probably more Atlanta specific, is I saw a reference a couple of years ago to an article that indicated that Atlanta was emerging as the kind of seed capital center of the US, just in terms of number of deals that where the percentage of funding was directed towards early stage. And so that was in some sense a reflection of the vibrancy of the eco space. You know, we're a tech center. Now we've got, you know, the huge number of, I actually think Georgia Tech turns out more engineers than just about any other school. We've got engineering schools in the rest of the state and in contiguous states. But there's also a lot of interest in and the evolution of angel investing that's come along. Interestingly, I would say 5, 7, certainly 10 years ago, the concern was that the companies would get started up in Atlanta, but then venture capital functioned in a way where they wanted access to the venture. They would invest in an Atlanta company and they would want them moved to Silicon Valley or to Boston or wherever. And the evolution you're talking about, Amelia, is that we've now seen more venture capital move into Atlanta. And I think some of that is just why move this entity? It's much more expensive to keep it going in San Francisco or Boston. Atlanta is a very cost-effective location, but the opportunity, some of these funds are local funds. And so we are seeing the emergence of a venture capital community in Atlanta, which is very exciting to see.
Yeah, and some of these are actually being founded even by alumni of Goizueta. So yes, like Overline and Silicon Road, and these are all been recently new funds that are injecting in the economy. So the other thing that you mentioned, Rob, is the sort of counter trend, because generally overall globally we've seen that the seed and early stage funding has a trend downwards, with more money going to larger deals and to, you know, later stages in the deals. But in Atlanta, and that's exciting, obviously for us, a lot of the money is going to those earlier sort of stages.
Hey, Amelia,
so, yeah.
We had a question in the chat about how an entrepreneur might seek funding to sponsor a longer term initiative before they become sustainable. So you were just talking about those early stage fundings. Is that something you could address briefly?
Yes, certainly. I mean, again, the typical pipeline goes, you know, angel funding, VC funding, you know, and then it goes to the later stages. But typically there are a lot of VCs that do specialize in the early stages, even pre-revenue. We have a program that we are running out of the business school that focuses on early stage companies that are raising between $500,000 and $5 million. It's the Raise Forum. We run it twice a year. For that one, we're typically looking for companies that have just basically started even demonstrating some traction. Obviously, a little bit of traction is necessary if you're looking for actual funding. But otherwise, there are also alternative fundings are starting to become more interesting. We've seen this trend where people are looking for example, with crowdsourcing, or they're looking for funding from grants and funding from actually equity-based funding. So there are many alternative ways of funding that are not necessarily only VC funds, and we're seeing a bit more of the emergence of that. Rob, I don't know if you want to mention anything else here.
No, I think that covers it pretty well, actually.
Great. So in the, you know, we're seeing also, as we were talking about, many venture capital firms in town, but also many firms that are actually not funded by these investors, as we were saying. So MailChimp was the example we talked about earlier. So if we move into the CEI and some of the activities we're doing here, I'd already mentioned the forum that we run. We have opportunities for our students and our alumni to pitch to some of the angels and VCs. For that, we're trying to build a lot of relationships with these early stage investors In fact, one of the things that we brought on board just in the last year was a new award program that goes to early stage and angel investors in the Atlanta areas. And it's named after one of our alumni, Sig Mosley, who is the godfather of investing here in Atlanta, as they call him. And it is just another way for us to actually be participant in the ecosystem, so outside of the walls of campus, and build an understanding and an awareness of who these angels are. Just back to that question there, so that we know once our students are ready and are in that phase, or alumni, that we have those relationships to be able to reach out to these investors. Same thing, you know, we are building a lot of connections with ecosystem partners and apprenticeship opportunities. And recently, one other thing that we've done, because we've seen the need for more student-led funds, there was an announcement, I'm not sure if many of you have seen it, of a new student-led fund focused on diverse founders. This was funded also by Emory. It's $1 million fund, and it will allow students that are interested in going into investing careers to actually practice those investment opportunities early on. It will be a sort of co-curricular program, but it again, as we're seeing more and more students not necessarily going in the tracks of consulting and investment banking, but wanting to go in these earlier stage investing tracks, this allows for that practice opportunity.
Yeah, and I would add that it is directed at addressing what's been uncovered through pretty rigorous research as a shortcoming of the venture capital market. So there's a lot of work that's been done that tends to support the fact that Black entrepreneurs, Hispanic entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs are systematically underfunded relative to their numbers in terms of startups. So less than 2% goes to minority entrepreneurs. I think less than 1%, we're talking about venture capital investment, less than 1% goes to women. Interestingly, there are some research studies that have been done that tend to find actually women-run ventures tend to look better on growth and return, but they're still not getting this capital. And now we know it's sort of a function of people's networks, that you basically are living in a world of people that you've made past investments in, you're finding deals and feeding them to each other. So network effects are kind of exclusionary for those folks that don't have a history of being in that space. And so this is sort of typical of what as a university we do. If we find issues in the research, it's a laboratory for students to investigate why does that hold up? What can we do to kind of address some of those challenges? How can we prepare our minority students and women entrepreneurs to address these factors when they get into the marketplace? So some of the programs we develop are experiential to address issues in the research, and some of them are just to support students advance in a career, for example, in this instance, in venture capital.
Yeah, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, essentially. As we build more people that go into those careers, those people go at more senior levels, and obviously will tend to select, you know, diverse founders, women founders, etc. So we're trying to also diversify that sort of in the market. So do we want to move to the third section? Because I know we're getting to close.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is one of the things we didn't mention related to, or maybe you didn't, I missed it, related to the RAISE Forum, is we actually created that to address what I mentioned earlier, where there was plenty of angel investing in Atlanta, but not venture investing. And Charlie Getz, our faculty member, one of our faculty members, sort of recognized this. He's an entrepreneur and an investor himself. But basically what was happening was growing ventures were being dragged out of Atlanta when the venture capital money came. And so this forum was created as a way to recognize that challenge. And so the idea was, let's create a forum where the investments are intended for companies that are from the Southeast. And it's not binding, but the notion was the commitment is to stay in the Southeast, at least for, I think, a period of 5 years or so. And so we've seen corresponding to that. We've done this about 5 years, I think. Pretty good success on deal flow and investments. But we've also seen grow up around this venture capital community where that's less of a concern. We don't see the need to move folks out as much.
Great. So these were just some charts that we talked about earlier, just showing essentially a massive amount of increase in global funding. We can go to the next one. This one hones in on Atlanta, and we're already halfway in the year, and we're starting to see that the trend that we saw last year, $2 billion injected in our market, and now only half year in, and we're at $3 billion. So massive growth expected across a number of different deals. So great. So we can move probably now to the third section. This is one that's really interesting for us because we're seeing a lot of different business schools tend to be focusing a lot on the earlier parts that we talked about, entrepreneurship and investing. And this is an area that both Rob and I are very passionate about and really want to see that growing, especially also because of where we are here in Atlanta, also in the ecosystem. This is a huge corporate city. Atlanta has a tremendous amount of large companies, Fortune 500s, and we're starting to see more and more the increase of corporate incubation opportunities. I mean, there are about 40 innovation centers here. So every company that is a large company is well respected has an incubation for startups here. And what we're seeing emerging new interesting models where these large corporations kind of come together, like, for example, with the Engage Fund, which large companies put in a certain amount of large funds, and together they seek opportunities through startups that are solving common problems. So these are things that are really interesting and attractive to us to focus on. Obviously, as more and more of our students go into larger companies, they're also looking for alternative tracks and alternative ways of making an impact in areas that are focused more on sort of innovation and spin-offs and ways to participate at the intersection of entrepreneurship and corporate and the corporate world, right? We're seeing more, like we have a chart on the next one that shows a bit more how, obviously large companies are growing by acquisition. They're growing by partnering with startups. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to see the fine line between large corporations and the startups. This is just showing, how some of the corporates are basically entering very fast through in the startup world.
Yeah, I guess the things I would add are just sort of what the motivating elements are. So I think to look at a chart like is up there now, there are some very large successful tech companies that are newer. So I'm thinking of Amazon and Google, and they're not new ventures. They've been around for more than a decade plus. But one of the things they have done is to kind of press out and innovate very regularly, some of which is through kind of traditional business investment modes, but some of it's through acquisition of startups and their own venture groups internally, kind of mirroring their own experience. So you've got the newer ones that have this kind of notion of corporate venturing in their genes, if you will. And then I think the other ones are the older, more established companies that I think have been awakened by the recent focus on technological discontinuities, business model discontinuities, and nobody wants to be disrupted and made irrelevant. And so it's both old and new companies that are embracing this model. And I would say, thinking back about my own experience, I referenced before sort of what Exxon did. Exxon kind of really, back then it seemed like a lot of money, put $1 billion into these ventures, really didn't get very much out of them. Companies were not very good not very good at executing this strategy. They could find stuff, they couldn't figure out how to integrate it into their current operations. Sometimes they didn't have the logic and the competence to manage them well. And what we're seeing now is that some companies are getting actually quite good at finding the investment, sharing the risk with other investors, investing in things that they really want the startup to be a supplier. They don't need to own them, or they figure out I can be a minority investor and do well with this, or this one really fits. If we acquire it, we have a plan to integrate it. So companies are getting better at managing their new venture initiatives. And that's why we're seeing kind of more of it emerge.
Yeah, and it's almost a non-choice anymore because the average lifespan has gone down so much. So in order for them to survive, they're having to acquire a lot of these companies. I mean, we think of Facebook, but Facebook's a baby in the corporate lifespan, general lifespan, and they're already being disrupted so much, right, by many different companies. So
yeah, and one thing I would add, I did see the comment from somebody that said this could be also a version of vertical integration. That's a lot of what Amazon did was, into cloud services and some other stuff. That was a step into vertical integration. So you see them both as diversification and vertical integration. Sorry, go ahead, Amelia.
Oh yeah, no, we're just showing a quick chart, and everybody's kind of familiar a little bit with where all the large corporations are here in town. We're trying to, again, also work closely with them to work also on innovative projects with many of these companies. In fact, some of the work that we do in the classroom, we actually do work it in conjunction with a number of large corporations. Oftentimes we ask them to bring problems to the classroom. And whether it's, these large Fortune 500 through our capstone case program, where, their students are working for an extended period of time with them to try to solve some of these problems and try to bring a little bit more of an innovative perspective to solving those problems. So it allows our classroom to be in the real world. And we're doing the same thing both with large corporations and with startups, so that we're not operating sort of in a vacuum there. Those were examples of some of the things that we're doing. There's also a lot of research that's happening. So, for example, Professor Jill Perry-Smith, who leads sort of our strategic initiative, does a lot of work around innovation and creativity. I mean, these are areas that, again, like Professor Cassandra said earlier, that we're trying to uncover where are those pockets of opportunity for us, sort of through the research that we can then bring back into the classroom. Some of the classroom teachings also, obviously, we're doing the usual, design thinking and bringing that to students, but also more uniquely different ways of approaching the future. So, for example, we have these futuring exercises where we look at specific industries. So Professor Dai, for example, is going to do one in the spring focused on the future of healthcare. What is healthcare going to look like in 10, 20 years? So we are trying to basically build a muscle sort of to try to bring the lens at a longer time span rather than just looking at the shorter time span. And that's kind of how those are the exercises that as our students, are moving into the corporate world, they'll be able to utilize those skill sets and going into the real world there.
Yeah, one thing I would add, since you mentioned Professor Jill Perry-Smith, I believe she's going to do a business over breakfast session on her research related to creativity and innovation. She does great work. I think it'd be an interesting session.
Great setup, Rob. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. I've got a question that's relevant to this corporate innovation. Excuse me. Greg asked, he's working in a large company and sees the challenges with the organic innovation. And, the pathways that you just talked about are a great way to outsource innovation, if you will. But what are your thoughts about this whole process impacting the corporation in a negative way? Because you can see some degree of early stage catch and kill. He puts in kind of air quotes. He says, I realize it's just economics, but I love true disruptors and don't want to see that market dynamic go away. So how might you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one to address. So the whole notion is, and we teach it in the classroom. One of the things you need to do with a strategic orientation is constantly be scanning the external environment for potential competitors. And increasingly new ventures are the guys that show up sometimes with a degree of agility where they can kind of outrun the established player. They bring a different competitive advantage or a competitive value proposition that's really challenging for the incumbent. And so then the notion of a large firm is, I got to deal with those guys and maybe acquiring them is one strategy. And sometimes the companies are good about saying this gets added to my portfolio, right? So we've seen Facebook do that with some of the acquisitions that they've made. But other times, the notion is the catch and kill idea is I'm going to sit on this thing. I'm going to buy it. It's worth me spending whatever it is to not have this competitor out there. I'm not sure what could be done about that. I think there's a fair amount of, we've never seen more venture capital available. We've never seen more ideas. And so if there's a real opportunity to create value, then there may be others that follow in that same space. But that's a little bit of the messiness of the market at work.
So you mentioned a few minutes ago about, women entrepreneurs, women VCs. Do you have any, I guess, advice to offer, especially around minority women, how they might approach a new startup with little to no startup funding, corporate experience, or network avenues or pathways for them?
Yeah, so I would say, and Amelia's well connected to this as also. I don't think there's ever been as much interest in addressing this challenge, and so we're now finding dedicated incubators all across town that are focused on women entrepreneurs, that are focused on minority entrepreneurs. I think there's a receptivity if somebody wants to reach out to somebody they find generally in the community that is successful, that's a woman entrepreneur, a minority entrepreneur, to seek some mentorship, to seek advice. There are these accelerator programs that get targeted where bring your idea and let's spend a day a week for 10 or 12 weeks developing your idea across the typical canvas of the steps that you would take to test the market and test your operational idea and what do the financials look like. And so usually these things are available actually with no cost, depending on the setting. So I would say to scan for resources. And we're happy to share our listings of resources. But actually just Google searches, I think, will turn up all kinds of resources almost by locality where these things are available.
Yeah, and I was just reading the Embark just did a study on the Southeast venture landscape, and it was just showing how the Southeast is actually ahead of the rest of the regions in the US in terms of funding also to female founders. And even just within our group, we have a few entrepreneurs in residence that are VCs focusing specifically on funding to female founders. So definitely reach out and we can share some of those resources.
Great, thank you. Amelia, we've got a question. We've got time for like a couple more questions. So this one, I think, takes us to a little broader scale and was directed to you. It's with your experience in the global sector, how do you see the improvement of entrepreneurship in emerging markets relative to current business infrastructure, as well as perceived corruptions in these markets, kind of the risk versus reward question?
Yes, so it's interesting that you bring up that question. We're actually doing some work with the MBA program office right now to review our whole global strategy in terms of how we partner with a number of different places, geographies, and organizations to support our network of students and alumni. So it's something that we're looking at very closely. We're literally putting a map on the table and kind of trying to look at where are the places where more emergence is happening, where are the most strategic alliances and partnership that we can actually build as a school. Obviously those issues, we're not going to get into that those are always going to be there, but there are some great places. I think I saw in the chat, Europe is growing really, really fast. There are some markets out there that have even, some of our alumni based there. So we're starting to see the increased interest. We have a lot of presence also in the Asian market. And again, it goes both ways. So us looking over there in terms of building partnerships there, but a lot of our students are international students from these different geographies.
Yeah,
so
the only thing I would add is we obviously study Atlanta first, the U.S. after that, and then global follows. But we are seeing more interest in the rest of the world as a site to focus the energy of the entrepreneurial effort. We're finding a number of first and second generation immigrants coming to the U.S., being educated in U.S. schools and wanting to do initiatives that tie back to their home country. So we're seeing more of that. Of course, the challenge is, I think there's no market that is as efficiently developed from a capital perspective as the U.S. is. So I think the challenge when you get to certainly developing countries is there's no shortage of ideas, but sometimes it's the lack of infrastructure or a lack of available capital for investment that limits the opportunity. I did, by the way, want to say, I saw in the chat there was a comment from Joshua referencing the fact that Atlanta has been designated in one study as a sort of center for Hispanic entrepreneurship. There's also an article, I think, in Wired magazine a couple of years ago designating Atlanta as the sort of center for Black entrepreneurship. So this goes back to the question about somebody who was in a minority looking for resources. Actually, Atlanta is a pretty supportive environment for that, and we're excited to see a lot of that going on around us.
All right, last question, quick answer, if you will. So a question popped in about who owns the rights for innovation that's created by an entrepreneur, the VC/incubator or Emory. I'm presuming the question is when this is a student and the innovations occur while they're a student.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting question. We don't firstly, we don't do a lot of direct investment ourselves. That's something we would like to get to, but most business schools will do grants, sometimes as high as $100,000 in support of a student, and interestingly, don't take an equity position in it. And now there are others that will, but so far we haven't. We are seeing some funds being created by alums that are more traditional venture funds, where the alums will take a position. But right now, for the things we've seen at the business school, we don't take an equity position in that. There is a kind of standard approach to intellectual property across Emory University. And some of you may have seen that the most recent treatment for COVID-19 is a medicine that one can take. And that was actually developed here at Emory through something called DRIVE. And so usually the university gets a piece of it, the department they came from gets, I think, a piece of it, and then the individual gets a piece of it as well. But that's a established structure. But for the business school, we actually don't take an equity position.
Yeah, not even in our accelerator. We run an accelerator where we're supporting a lot of startups. It is not part of our philosophy, essentially.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you both. This has been so intriguing and interesting. You can tell by the flood of comments in the chat box, as well as a number of questions that we weren't able to get to. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Amelia. And thank you, participants, because you've had so many great questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them today. But we do want to take just a few moments to preview what's coming next with our Business Over Breakfast series. So as Rob mentioned, Jill Perry-Smith is going to be with us on the third Thursday of October to talk about making innovation happen, how you optimize collaboration from conception to completion. And then we are really excited to have an ESG series coming in November and December. We're going to start with a faculty panel, and then we'll move into sustainability standards, what to report, why it's important, and then how you build an eco-friendly brand, and then conscious capitalism, a focus on BCorps that are on the rise. We also want to feature our upcoming open enrollment programs. You can find more about these on our website. And as we've mentioned in previous Business Over Breakfasts, we are thrilled to be launching our Goizueta Executive Women's Leadership Program designed for women who mean business. Again, you can just Google Goizueta Executive Women's Leadership Program to learn more, and our exciting new Growth Leaders Academy. This is designed specifically for teams inside of companies, large and small, that are really wanting to change the growth trajectory of your company. Again, check more out on our website. And finally, we want to invite you to complete the survey at the conclusion of today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you in a couple of weeks for our Business Over Breakfast session, and have a great rest of the day.